I found my daughter begging in the street while carrying her child, and the man responsible was sleeping in the apartment I helped buy. My name is Carlos, and at 68 years old I thought I'd seen everything. 40 years managing a small logistics fleet in Queens taught me that life throws curveballs, but nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for that Tuesday afternoon in July. The heat was brutal, the kind that makes asphalt shimmer and tempers flare. I was stuck in traffic near the Queensboro Bridge, coming back from Mount Sinai, where my doctor had just warned me about my blood pressure climbing. He suggested I avoid stress. The universe had a dark sense of humor. Through my windshield, between honking cars and cursing drivers, I saw a thin figure weaving through traffic. Barefoot, hair matted, clothes that looked salvaged from dumpsters. She carried something against her chest, a baby, barely moving in a worn carrier. She extended her hand to car windows, counting coins with a desperation that made my chest tighten. When she approached my window, our eyes met. The world stopped spinning. Beatrice, my daughter, 24 years old, the girl who graduated top of her design class 2 years ago, the woman who married that charming young man in the big church wedding I paid for. She was supposed to be living in that Upper East Side apartment, the one with the view of Central Park, the one I co-signed for because Enrique convinced me it was an investment in their future. She tried to cover her face. Shame and fear fought for dominance in her expression. In her arms, my granddaughter Alice, 11 months old, red-faced from the heat, wearing a diaper that looked days old. I want you to understand something about rage. Real rage isn't hot. It's ice cold and sharp as surgical steel. That's what filled my veins as I pulled my daughter and granddaughter into my car while drivers behind me laid on their horns. Because I knew in that instant that someone had done this to her. Someone had taken everything I'd worked for, everything I'd given to secure her future, and turned my child into a beggar on the streets of New York. And I was going to find out who, and I was going to make them pay. If you want to know how an old man took down the people who destroyed his family, stay with me. The silence in my car was suffocating as I drove. Beatrice clutched Alice against her chest, her body trembling despite the heat. I kept my eyes on the road because if I looked at her too long, I'd lose control, and she didn't need my rage right now. She needed safety. I didn't drive home. My apartment in Astoria would be the first place Enrique would look if he knew she'd been found. Instead, I headed to Hoboken, across the river, to a small boarding house run by Roberto Silva, a friend from my old trucking days. Roberto owed me favors going back 20 years, and more importantly, he knew how to keep his mouth shut. The room was basic. A bed, a bathroom, clean sheets. Roberto took one look at Beatrice and Alice and disappeared, returning with food, baby formula, and diapers. He didn't ask questions. That's the kind of friend you need when your world is collapsing. After Beatrice fed Alice and put her down to sleep, she finally spoke. Her voice was hollow, like someone had scooped out everything that made her alive. She told me that 3 months ago, 2 weeks after Alice was born, Enrique and his mother Marcia came to her with papers. She was exhausted, barely sleeping, her body still recovering. They said the documents were routine, something about refinancing the apartment to get better rates, putting the car title in Enrique's name for insurance purposes. She signed. God help her, she signed everything they put in front of her. Within a week, she discovered the apartment was no longer in her name. The car was gone. The savings account she'd built from her design work, $60,000 she'd earned before Alice was born, had been emptied. When she confronted Enrique, he became someone she didn't recognize. He informed her that the money was now invested in his mother's real estate portfolio, that the apartment and car were better protected under his sole ownership, and that she should be grateful he was handling their finances since she was clearly too unstable to manage anything. Marcia was worse. She told Beatrice that I was a controlling old man who would poison their marriage, that her son deserved compensation for taking care of a woman with postpartum problems, that if Beatrice went to me for help, they would file for full custody of Alice based on her mental instability. For 2 months, Beatrice lived as a prisoner in what was supposed to be her own home. Then, 14 days ago, Henrique came home with his brother Ricardo and 2 large men. They gave her 30 minutes to pack 1 bag. They kept Alice in another room while Beatrice gathered what she could. Marcia handed her $200 and stated that if Beatrice contacted anyone, me, the police, lawyers, they had documentation ready to prove she was an unfit mother. They had videos they'd recorded of her crying, edited to make her look deranged. They had fake text messages showing her threatening suicide. They put her out on the street and told her she was lucky they didn't call child services right then. My daughter spent 2 weeks sleeping in subway stations, in shelters when there was space, begging for money to buy formula. She was terrified that if she came to me, they'd take Alice away forever. I sat in that boarding house room listening to this, and something fundamental shifted inside me. I'd built my business from nothing. I'd loaded trucks in blizzards, negotiated with suppliers who tried to cheat me, dealt with unions and bureaucrats and criminals who thought an old immigrant was easy prey. I survived because I learned to think 3 moves ahead and strike without warning. Henrique and Marcia had just made the worst mistake of their lives. They'd assumed that because I was old, I was helpless. They'd gambled that I'd accept this quietly or die trying to fight them legally through channels they'd already corrupted with their lies. They were about to learn what decades of experience really meant. The next morning, I left Beatrice and Alice with Roberto and drove into Manhattan with a purpose that felt almost religious. My first stop was an office building in the financial district, 5th floor, corner office. Tiago Mendes was a lawyer I'd worked with 15 years ago when a freight company tried to muscle me out of a route contract. He was ruthless, brilliant, and expensive. More importantly, he hated bullies. Tiago listened to my story without interrupting, his fingers steepled under his chin. When I finished, he leaned back in his leather chair and stated 3 words that changed everything. He told me this was criminal fraud, not just a civil matter, coercion of a vulnerable person, identity theft, extortion. If we could prove the pattern, and he emphasized that word heavily, we could potentially bring criminal charges that would send Henrique and Marcia to prison. But we needed evidence, real, documented, irrefutable evidence. My second stop was a walk-up office in Chinatown that smelled like cigarettes and printer ink. Daniel Park was a private investigator who'd helped me once when I suspected a dispatcher of skimming fuel receipts. He was thorough, discreet, and had connections in places I didn't want to know about. Daniel took notes in a battered notebook, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When I mentioned Ricardo, Henrique's brother, he looked up sharply. He informed me that he recognized that name. Ricardo Santos had been flagged in 2 ongoing investigations for selling stolen property through online marketplaces. If Ricardo was involved in moving Beatrice's car, there would be a digital trail. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in 30 years. I went to confession at St. Rita's in East Harlem, the church where I'd been married, where Beatrice was baptized. Father Tomas was 90 if he was a day, deaf in one ear, but sharp as a tack. I told him everything, and when I was done he gave me the strangest absolution I'd ever received. He reminded me that the Bible speaks of righteous anger, that turning the other cheek doesn't mean allowing evil to flourish unchallenged. He also warned me not to let revenge consume my soul, to remember that justice and vengeance were different animals. I left that church with a clear conscience and a battle plan. That week, I played the role of a broken old man. I called Enrique's phone, the number Beatrice had given me, and left a message. I said I'd heard rumors that Beatrice was having problems, that I was worried, that maybe we could all sit down and talk like family. My voice cracked perfectly when I mentioned Alice. Henrique returned my call within an hour. His voice dripped with false concern as he explained that Beatrice had left of her own accord, that she'd been struggling with postpartum depression, that he and his mother had tried to help, but she'd become violent. He suggested that for Alice's safety, perhaps it was better if I gave them some space. I played along. I expressed my understanding, asked if there was anything I could do financially to help with Alice's care. Henrique paused. I could hear the greed calculating on the other end, then mentioned that raising a child was expensive, that if I wanted to contribute to a trust fund, he could arrange the paperwork. I told him I'd think about it and hung up. That night, Daniel called with his first piece of gold. Ricardo had indeed listed Beatrice's SUV, a nearly new Lexus RX 350, on 3 different online marketplaces under fake seller accounts. The VIN numbers matched. More importantly, Ricardo had been sloppy. His IP address was traceable to an apartment in Bushwick that he shared with 2 other men who had outstanding warrants. Tiago's assistant, a sharp woman named Patricia, started pulling public records. The apartment that was supposed to be in Henrique and Beatrice's names was now solely in Henrique's name. The mortgage refinancing had happened 2 days after Alice's birth, when Beatrice would have still been in the hospital. The signature on the documents looked wrong. We'd need a handwriting expert, but Patricia suspected forgery. The savings account was more complicated. The money had been transferred to an LLC that Marcia Santos controlled. The LLC had then purchased 3 rental properties in Newark. The paper trail was deliberately tangled, designed to make recovery seem impossible. But here's what Enrique and Marcia didn't understand about men my age. We grew up in a time before computers made everything easy. We learned to read patterns in paper receipts, to spot discrepancies in ledgers, to follow money through creative accounting. I'd spent 4 decades tracking shipments across 3 states, making sure every dollar was accounted for. This was just another ledger to decode. I called Beatrice that night to tell her I was making progress. She cried so hard she couldn't speak. Alice babbled in the background, and for the first time in 2 weeks I heard something like hope in the chaos. I made a promise then to my daughter and to that innocent baby. I swore that before this was over, Henrique and Marcia would lose everything they'd stolen. They'd lose their freedom, their reputation, their future. They thought they'd beaten a foolish old man by destroying his daughter. They'd actually just declared war on someone who'd survived every dirty trick the logistics industry could throw at him for 40 years. The following Tuesday, I arranged a meeting with Enrique and Marcia. We met at a diner in Jackson Heights, neutral territory, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. I arrived early, ordered coffee, and waited with my hands slightly trembling, not from nerves, but from carefully controlled fury disguised as age. When they walked in, I studied them with new eyes. Henrique was 32, athletic build, expensive watch, hair gelled back like some Wall Street clone. Marcia was mid-50s, designer handbag, jewelry that probably cost more than my monthly pension. They looked successful, prosperous, confident. They looked like people who'd never faced real consequences. I played my role perfectly. I asked about Alice with a grandfather's worry, mentioned how hard it must be raising a child without Beatrice's help, wondered if maybe I'd been too hard on my daughter over the years. Henrique and Marcia exchanged glances. I saw the calculation happening, the mutual agreement that I was exactly what they'd hoped. A sad old fool who could be milked for more money. Henrique explained with practiced concern that Beatrice had unfortunately proven incapable of motherhood. He claimed she'd threatened to harm herself, that she'd abandoned Alice multiple times, that he'd had no choice but to prioritize his daughter's safety. Marcia added that they'd consulted with lawyers and therapists, that everything they'd done was for Alice's protection. I nodded slowly, wiped at my eyes, and said I understood. I mentioned that I had some savings, about $80,000, that maybe I could set up for Alice's future. Would they be willing to manage it since I wasn't good with these modern investment things? The greed that flashed across their faces was almost beautiful in its nakedness. Enrique assured me they could absolutely help with that his mother had excellent financial advisors, that we should definitely set up a trust fund. He suggested we meet again next week to discuss the details, maybe at Marcia's office in Newark where we could have privacy. I agreed, playing the grateful grandfather, thanking them for taking such good care of my granddaughter in such difficult circumstances. When I left that diner, I shuffled a little, made myself look smaller, older, defeated. The moment I got to my car, I called Daniel. I told him to follow Marcia home and to document everything at that Newark address. I suspected the office she'd mentioned was actually one of the properties she'd bought with Beatrice's money, and if we could prove she was using stolen funds for business operations, that was another criminal charge. Then I called Tiago and informed him we needed to accelerate our timeline. These people were planning to rob me next, which meant they felt comfortable, untouchable. Comfortable people made mistakes. Over the next 3 days, Daniel worked magic. He traced Marcia's vehicle, photographed the Newark property, a renovated brownstone she was advertising as luxury office space, and pulled permits that showed the renovation costs exceeded $200,000. The timeline matched perfectly with when Beatrice's savings had disappeared. He also discovered something unexpected. Marcia had a third son, Eduardo, who lived in Florida and apparently wanted nothing to do with his family. Daniel managed to reach him by phone, and Eduardo proved more than willing to talk. He explained that his mother had pulled the same financial schemes on him 5 years ago, that Enrique had always been her favorite and accomplice, that he'd cut ties to protect himself and his own family. Eduardo agreed to provide testimony if needed. He even sent copies of documents showing similar patterns of fraud from years past. Meanwhile, I kept up my performance. I called Enrique twice more, each time sounding more scattered, more desperate for family connection. I mentioned selling my apartment to fund Alice's future, said I was thinking about moving to a retirement community anyway. I could hear him salivating through the phone, but here's what they didn't know. Every conversation was being recorded, legally because New York is a one-party consent state, and I was that one party. Every word they spoke about Beatrice's supposed instability, every lie about her abandoning Alice, every fabrication about seeking legal advice, all documented, time-stamped, saved. Tiago's handwriting expert confirmed what we suspected. The signatures on the apartment refinancing documents weren't Beatrice's. They were close. Someone had practiced. But the pressure points were wrong. The letter formations subtly different. That was forgery, plain and simple. On Friday night, I visited Beatrice and Alice at the boarding house. My daughter looked better. Roberto's wife had taken her to a women's clinic, got her proper vitamins, some decent clothes. Alice was crawling now, babbling happily, unaware of the storm surrounding her young life. Beatrice asked me what I was doing, whether we had a case. I held her hand and promised her something I'd learned in 40 years of business. I told her that the key to defeating an enemy wasn't strength or money or connections. It was patience. It was making them so confident in their victory that they exposed every vulnerability, documented every crime, created their own evidence trail. I explained that Enrique and Marcia thought they were hunting an old, confused man with money to steal. What they didn't realize was that they'd been the prey from the moment they'd answered my first phone call. Sometimes, I told her, the best weapon an old man has is being underestimated. And these fools had underestimated me so thoroughly, they were about to write their own convictions. Understanding your enemy is half the battle. My father taught me that when I was 16, working my first warehouse job. He'd survived the Cuban Revolution by knowing which way the wind was blowing before anyone else felt the breeze. I thought about him constantly during those weeks of investigation, wondering what he'd say about a family that ate its own. Daniel's deep dive into Marcia's finances revealed something darker than simple greed. The woman was drowning. Her real estate portfolio looked impressive on paper, but underneath it was a house of cards. She'd over-leveraged on 4 properties in Newark and Jersey City, betting on development projects that stalled when the market cooled. She owed 3 different banks, had maxed out multiple credit lines, and was juggling mortgage payments like a street performer with flaming torches. Beatrice's $60,000 hadn't been invested for returns. It had been a lifeline to keep Marcia from foreclosure. But here's where it got interesting. Daniel discovered that 2 months before Alice was born, Enrique had lost his job. He'd been working as a sales associate at a medical device company, decent money, and they'd fired him for falsifying expense reports. The same pattern, stealing from people who trusted him. They'd planned this. The timing was too perfect. They'd waited until Beatrice was pregnant, vulnerable, legally bound to Enrique. Then they'd struck when she was at her weakest, right after childbirth, when her body and mind were exhausted. The apartment I'd co-signed for was worth $700,000. They couldn't sell it outright without my signature, but they'd refinanced and pulled out $200,000 in equity. That money had vanished into another one of Marcia's LLCs, this one called Santos Family Investments. Tiago's team found something even more disturbing. Marcia had done this before, not just to Eduardo, but to 2 previous daughters-in-law. 10 years ago, Enrique's older brother Antonio had been married to a woman named Sofia. Same pattern. Sofia had owned a small bakery in Newark. Within a year of marrying Antonio, the bakery was in Marcia's name. Sofia disappeared from public records after the divorce, and when Daniel finally located her in Pennsylvania, she refused to talk beyond confirming that the Santos family had destroyed her financially and emotionally. The second victim was Ricardo's ex-wife, Ana. She'd inherited a commercial property from her grandfather. After marrying Ricardo, the property somehow ended up in Marcia's portfolio. Ana now lived in Virginia, working 2 jobs to support 3 kids. She was willing to talk, and her story was identical to Beatrice's: coerced signatures, exploitation during pregnancy, threats involving custody. This wasn't opportunistic crime. This was a system. Marcia Santos had turned her sons into predators who hunted vulnerable women with assets, married them, stripped them of everything they owned, and discarded them. I sat in my apartment that night, looking at the wall of documents and photographs Daniel had compiled. My coffee had gone cold hours ago. The city hummed outside my window. Sirens, traffic, the eternal noise of New York that usually comforted me. Tonight, it felt like a soundtrack to human cruelty. But something else crystallized in my mind. This wasn't just about getting justice for Beatrice. If we took down Marcia and Enrique, we'd be speaking for Sofia and Ana, and probably other women we hadn't found yet. We'd be stopping them from doing this to the next target. I thought about Alice sleeping in that boarding house room. If we didn't stop this pattern now, what kind of example were we setting? That predators could win if they were clever enough. That old men like me should just accept defeat and let the young wolves have their way? The hell with that. I made another call to Eduardo in Florida. I asked him bluntly why he was willing to help, what he wanted out of this. His answer was simple and honest. He said his mother had poisoned his relationship with his own daughter, that his brothers were beyond saving, and that maybe by stopping them now, he could sleep at night knowing he'd finally done something right. Eduardo agreed to fly to New York when we needed him. More importantly, he had copies of his mother's financial records from years ago, documents she'd probably forgotten existed that showed the same pattern of fraud stretching back 15 years. That's when Tiago called with news that made my hands shake. A forensic accountant he'd hired had traced Beatrice's $60,000 through Marcia's various LLCs. The money had been used as a down payment on a condo in Atlantic City. The condo was registered to a corporation, but the beneficial owner, buried in 3 layers of paperwork, was Henrique's girlfriend, while married to Beatrice, while forcing her to sleep in subway stations. The accountant had more. Phone records showed hundreds of calls between Enrique and this woman, dating back 8 months before Alice was born. Hotel charges, restaurant receipts, jewelry purchases. Enrique had been living a double life, funded entirely by the woman he'd married for her money. I asked Tiago what this meant legally. He explained that this level of systematic fraud, combined with a pattern of behavior toward multiple victims, elevated our case significantly. This wasn't a family dispute anymore. This was organized financial crime, potentially RICO territory if we could prove conspiracy. The district attorney's office might actually be interested. When I told Beatrice what we'd discovered, she became very quiet. Then she asked me a question that broke my heart. She wanted to know if she'd been that stupid, that blind, that easy to fool. I told her something I'd learned managing a fleet for 40 years. I explained that the best con artists don't target stupid people. They target decent people who assume others operate with the same honesty they do. Henrique had seemed charming because he'd practiced that charm on multiple women. Marcia had seemed welcoming because she'd perfected the role of supportive mother-in-law while planning the heist. My daughter hadn't been stupid. She'd been human. She'd loved someone who'd faked love to rob her. The difference now was that she had a father who understood that sometimes the system needs a push from someone who knows how to work it. And I'd spent 40 years learning every pressure point in bureaucracies, every way to make paperwork move faster, every connection that mattered. Henrique and Marcia had built their empire on the assumption that their victims would be too ashamed, too isolated, or too broken to fight back. They'd never encountered a victim who had a father with nothing left to lose and 40 years of experience in winning wars of attrition. The recording happened almost by accident, which is how the universe sometimes works when you're doing the right thing. It was a Saturday morning, and I was supposed to meet Henrique and Marcia at a cafe in Brooklyn to discuss the trust fund for Alice. I had agreed to bring my financial documents, play the senile grandfather ready to sign over his life savings. But the night before, my car developed a mysterious problem, courtesy of Daniel, who'd suggested we needed a reason for me to be late. I called Enrique to reschedule, apologized profusely, suggested they just meet at the cafe anyway since I was paying for breakfast. I'd join them as soon as the mechanic finished. What I didn't mention was that Daniel was already sitting at a corner table in that cafe, wearing a baseball cap and reading a newspaper, with a recording device that could pick up conversations from 20 feet away. Henrique and Marcia showed up right on time. Daniel later told me they'd looked annoyed checking their watches, clearly frustrated that their payday was delayed. They ordered expensive lattes, charging to a tab I'd stupidly opened, and started talking. The beauty of narcissists is they can't help performing, even for each other. Marcia complained that her stupid son Eduardo had been asking questions about family finances, wondering if this was going to cause problems. Henrique assured her that Eduardo was irrelevant, that he'd cut ties years ago and had no legal standing to interfere. Then Henrique started talking about me. He stated, clearly and with evident satisfaction, that I was exactly as pathetic as Beatrice had been, too trusting, too desperate for family connection, too stupid to see obvious manipulation. He laughed when he mentioned how I'd actually asked if I should sell my apartment. Marcia responded that they should absolutely encourage that between my apartment's value and my savings, they could probably extract $300,000 before I caught on, but the golden moment came when Marcia, feeling expansive, started explaining their system. She referred to it as their system. She detailed how they identified targets, women with assets but weak family support, ideally during vulnerable times like pregnancy or grief. She explained how her sons would charm these women, isolate them from protective influences, then strike when resistance was lowest. She actually used the phrase "paid us back" for the trouble of dealing with them when referring to Sophia and Anna. Henrique added his own insights. He mentioned that the key was making the woman believe she was mentally unstable, that gaslighting was more effective than threats because it made them doubt their own perceptions. He bragged that Beatrice had been perfect because postpartum hormones made the psychological manipulation easier. They spent 45 minutes in that cafe, drinking $7 lattes, documenting their own criminal conspiracy in high-definition audio. When I finally arrived, apologizing, fumbling with papers, playing the confused old man, Daniel had already left with evidence that would sink them completely. That night, Tiago, Daniel, Patricia, and I met in the lawyer's conference room. We played the recording 3 times. Patricia actually applauded. Tiago, normally reserved, allowed himself a rare smile. He stated that this recording, combined with Eduardo's testimony, the forensic accounting, the forged signatures, and the pattern of multiple victims, gave us enough to approach the district attorney with a case that would be career-defining for a prosecutor. But we needed one more piece. We needed to prove Henrique's relationship with his girlfriend, show that he'd been defrauding Beatrice while maintaining a separate life. That would demonstrate intent, premeditation, consciousness of guilt. Daniel worked his magic again. He discovered that the girlfriend, a woman named Isabella, lived in Jersey City. She was a real estate agent who apparently had no idea Henrique was still married. Daniel befriended her receptionist, learned that Henrique visited 3 times a week, always on days he told Beatrice he was working late. Then we got lucky. Isabella's social media was public. She'd posted photos. Henrique at a restaurant, Henrique at the beach, Henrique at her birthday party. The timestamps corresponded to dates when Beatrice was 8 months pregnant, when Alice was being born, when my daughter was being put out on the street. In one photo, Henrique was wearing a watch that matched one listed as a purchase on the credit card he'd forced Beatrice to add him to. $3,000 for a Rolex, bought 2 weeks before he threw her out of her own home. Patricia cross-referenced credit card statements with GPS data from Henrique's phone, which he'd stupidly backed up to a cloud service using Beatrice's old email account, one she'd shared the password with me. We could place him at hotels, restaurants, and Isabella's apartment on dozens of occasions, all while he was supposedly living with Beatrice and caring for their newborn. The paper trail was complete. We had fraud, forgery, extortion, identity theft, conspiracy, and a pattern of behavior targeting multiple victims. We had audio confession. We had documentary evidence. We had willing witnesses. Tiago scheduled a meeting with the district attorney's office for the following Wednesday. But before we went to the authorities, I did something that probably wasn't legally advisable, but felt spiritually necessary. I called Isabella. I introduced myself as Henrique's father-in-law, and I heard her confusion through the phone. She insisted there must be some mistake. Henrique had told her he was divorced, that his ex-wife had moved to California, that there were no children. I sent her 3 things: a photo of Henrique and Beatrice's wedding, a copy of Alice's birth certificate listing Henrique as father, and a bank statement showing joint accounts that had been active until 8 weeks ago. Isabella's world collapsed in real time. I could hear it in her breathing. She asked me why I was telling her this. I explained that she deserved to know who she was involved with, that she was likely his next target, and that maybe she'd like to help ensure he never did this to anyone again. She agreed to meet with Tiago. She brought her own evidence, text messages, where Henrique had asked her for loans, mentioned investment opportunities, suggested she add him to her real estate license. The pattern was already starting. That night I stood at my apartment window watching the city lights blur in the distance. I thought about all the versions of myself I'd been, the young immigrant who'd unloaded trucks in blizzards, the businessman who'd built something from nothing, the husband who'd lost his wife too soon, the father who'd tried his best, the grandfather who'd been given a second chance. I thought about Beatrice and Alice, safe in that boarding house, waiting for me to make their world right again. I thought about Henrique and Marcia, smug in their expensive apartments, counting money they'd stolen, already planning their next victim. They'd built their castle on sand, and the tide was about to come in. The meeting with the district attorney happened on a Wednesday morning that felt like divine timing. The prosecutor assigned to our case was a woman named Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Morrison, mid-40s, with a reputation for going after white-collar criminals who thought they were untouchable. Tiago had done his homework. Morrison had recently won a major fraud case against a financial advisor who'd scammed elderly clients. She had no patience for people who exploited the vulnerable. Morrison listened to our presentation for 2 hours without interrupting. Tiago laid out the timeline. Patricia presented the financial analysis, Daniel provided the surveillance evidence, and I sat quietly, letting the professionals work. When we played the cafe recording, I watched Morrison's expression change from professional interest to cold fury. She asked pointed questions about every element of the case. Could we prove Beatrice hadn't consented to the property transfers? Yes, forged signatures, witnessed by a handwriting expert. Could we establish a pattern? Yes, Eduardo's testimony, Sophia's experience, Anna's parallel case. Could we show criminal intent? Yes. The recording where they literally described their system for targeting vulnerable women. Morrison leaned back in her chair and stated something that made my heart race. She indicated this was exactly the kind of case her office wanted to pursue, organized fraud targeting multiple victims, predators who'd operated with impunity for years. She asked if we'd be willing to let her office take the lead, which might mean the timeline would be slower, but the charges would be more comprehensive. Tiago looked at me. I nodded. This wasn't about speed anymore. It was about making sure they couldn't do this again. Morrison assigned 2 detectives to the case. Within a week, they'd obtained warrants to freeze Marcia's bank accounts and place liens on the properties purchased with stolen funds. They interviewed Eduardo, Sophia, and Anna. They brought in forensic accountants from the state attorney general's office. But here's where it got interesting. Morrison suggested we set a trap. She explained that if we arrested them immediately, they might claim the cafe conversation was taken out of context, that they were joking, that the audio was ambiguous. But if we could get them to actually attempt the fraud against me, to try to get my signature on documents transferring my assets, we'd have them attempting a crime in real time. With witnesses and documentation, I understood what she was proposing. I'd be bait. Tiago objected immediately. He argued it was dangerous, that if something went wrong I could lose my savings, that we had enough evidence without risking my financial security. But I'd made my decision before he finished talking. I'd been scared exactly once in this entire ordeal, when I'd seen my daughter begging on the street. Nothing Henrique and Marcia could do to me would ever match that fear again. And if playing the fool one more time meant ensuring they couldn't hurt anyone else, it was worth every risk. Morrison laid out the plan. I'd go through with the trust fund meeting at Marcia's Newark office. I'd bring my financial documents. They'd present papers for me to sign. What they wouldn't know was that detectives would be in the building, recording everything, ready to move the moment I signed under duress, or they revealed their true intentions. We scheduled it for the following Friday. Morrison emphasized that I should act naturally, let them lead the conversation, not push too hard or seem suspicious. If at any point I felt unsafe, there was a panic word, Brazil, that would bring the police immediately. The week leading up to that meeting was the longest of my life. I visited Beatrice every evening, reassuring her that everything was moving forward, that soon she and Alice would be safe. I didn't tell her about the sting operation. She'd worry, and she deserved some peace. I also spent time with Roberto and his wife Maria. They'd been housing my daughter and granddaughter for nearly a month, refusing any payment, treating Beatrice like their own child. Roberto told me something that stuck with me. He said that in the old country, Family meant something deeper than blood. It meant people who showed up when life went bad. By that definition, Enrique had never been family at all. Thursday night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with a bottle of scotch I'd been saving for a special occasion and thought about all the decisions that had led to this moment. Should I have seen Enrique's true nature earlier? Should I have investigated before co-signing that mortgage? Should I have been more involved in Beatrice's life instead of giving the young couple space? But regret is a luxury you can't afford when there's still a war to win. I'd beaten myself up after the operation, if we survived it. Friday morning arrived cold and clear. I dressed carefully, the cardigan with the worn elbows, the slacks that were slightly too big, the shoes that needed resolving. I wanted to look like a man whose best days were behind him, someone whose judgment could be questioned, whose signature might later be dismissed as the confusion of age. I drove to Newark with Detective Sarah Chen, following 3 cars behind, invisible in traffic. The office building was a converted brownstone in a neighborhood that was trying to look upscale but wasn't quite there yet. Marcia's office was on the 2nd floor, decorated with fake luxury, the kind of place that screamed new money, trying to seem established. Enrique was already there, wearing a suit that probably cost $2,000. Marcia wore too much jewelry and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. They greeted me like beloved family, made comments about how healthy I looked, asked if I'd had trouble finding the place. I played my part perfectly. I fumbled with my folder of documents, made a joke about how paperwork had gotten so complicated since the old days, expressed gratitude that they were helping me protect Alice's future. Marcia began her pitch smoothly. She explained that they'd set up a trust structure that would protect my assets from taxes and probate, ensure Alice was cared for, and give me peace of mind. All I needed to do was sign a few documents transferring my apartment and savings accounts into the trust, which Enrique would manage as trustee. She made it sound so reasonable, so caring. I asked simple questions, the kind a confused old man might ask. Who would control the money? Enrique, of course. When would Alice receive it? When she turned 18, or earlier if the trustee decided. Could I change my mind later? Well, that would defeat the purpose of the trust structure, wouldn't it? Enrique added his own touches. He mentioned how much easier my life would be without the burden of managing properties and accounts. He suggested that I might even want to consider moving into a nice senior community where I'd be looked after, where I wouldn't have to worry about anything. They were remarkably good at this. If I'd actually been the vulnerable old man they thought I was, I would have signed everything. Instead, I picked up the pen and said I wanted to read the documents carefully first. Marcia's smile tightened. She indicated that everything was standard legal language, that reading it would just confuse me, that Tiago had reviewed everything. That was the first lie we'd catch on tape. Tiago had reviewed nothing because these documents had never been sent to him. Enrique pressed harder. He reminded me that I'd asked them for help, that they were doing me a favor, that if I didn't trust family, who could I trust? I looked at these 2 people who'd destroyed my daughter's life, who'd left my granddaughter crying in subway stations, who'd built a career on exploiting the vulnerable. I thought about Sophia and Anna and all the other women they'd victimized. And I signed. Marcia practically snatched the papers, checking each signature, her relief visible. Enrique started talking about next steps, about helping me pack up my apartment, about finding a nice retirement community in Pennsylvania where I'd be more comfortable. That's when Morrison and Detective Chen walked through the door, badges out, 2 uniformed officers behind them. The looks on their faces were worth everything I'd risked. The transformation was instant and beautiful. Marcia's face went from triumph to terror in the space of a heartbeat. Enrique actually stepped backward, bumping into the desk, his expensive suit suddenly looking like costume jewelry under stage lights. Morrison's voice was professional, almost gentle. As she explained they were under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, identity theft, and extortion. She read them their rights while Detective Chen secured the documents I'd just signed, evidence of an attempted crime, now stopped mid-execution. Henrique tried to speak, started to say this was a misunderstanding, that I'd asked them for help. Morrison cut him off smoothly, informing him that they had recordings of his cafe conversation, that multiple victims had provided testimony, that forensic accountants had traced every dollar they'd stolen. I stood up from my chair, the tremble gone from my hands, my back straight. The transformation in my posture was as dramatic as the change in their faces. Marcia looked at me like she was seeing a ghost. I'd played the senile old fool so convincingly that she'd forgotten there was a real person underneath, someone who'd outsmarted her completely. Detective Chen handcuffed them both. Standard procedure, she explained, as if arresting people for systematically destroying families was just another Tuesday. In the hallway, I could see more officers entering the building, probably to secure evidence from Marcia's files. Morrison asked if I was okay, if I needed a moment. I told her I was fine, that I'd like to make a phone call. She nodded and stepped aside, giving me space. I called Beatrice. When she answered, I could hear Alice babbling in the background, normal baby sounds that seemed impossibly precious in that moment. I told my daughter that it was over, that Henrique and Marcia had been arrested, that the nightmare was ending. She didn't respond immediately. I think shock had stolen her voice. But then I heard her crying, the kind of tears that wash away months of terror. The next few hours were a blur of statements and procedures. I had to explain everything to multiple detectives, sign official documents, provide testimony about the attempted fraud. Tiago appeared at some point, looking vindicated and fiercely proud. Patricia was already working on the civil case to recover Beatrice's assets. But the real satisfaction came 2 days later, when Morrison called to update me on the investigation. After their arrest, facing overwhelming evidence, Ricardo had turned on his family immediately. He provided testimony about dozens of other schemes, admitted to selling Beatrice's car illegally, detailed how Marcia had operated her financial fraud network for over 15 years. His cooperation bought him a reduced sentence, but he was still going to prison. Isabella, Henrique's girlfriend, had also provided devastating testimony. Apparently, Henrique had already been setting up the same con on her. He'd convinced her to make him a signatory on her real estate business accounts just the week before. She was furious and cooperative, painting a picture of a man who'd faked love to rob her while his wife and infant daughter were homeless. The district attorney's office had filed charges that would likely result in 15 to 20 years for Enrique, 12 to 15 for Marcia. Eduardo's testimony about past victims, combined with Sofia and Anna's willingness to speak publicly, meant the sentencing judge would see this as a pattern of behavior deserving maximum punishment. But here's what really mattered. The forged documents were being invalidated. The apartment was being returned to Beatrice's name. The $60,000, along with penalties and interest, would be recovered from Marcia's seized assets. The equity they'd stolen from the apartment refinancing would be restored. More importantly, Alice would grow up knowing that her mother had fought for her, that her grandfather had refused to let injustice stand. That family meant protection, not exploitation. 3 weeks after the arrest, I walked into the courthouse for the bail hearing. Henrique and Marcia's lawyer argued they weren't flight risks, that they had ties to the community, that they deserved to fight their case from outside a cell. Morrison countered with a pattern of fraud, the multiple victims, the systematic nature of their crimes, and the evidence that they'd been planning to flee to Portugal using money from their latest attempted theft. The judge denied bail. I watched them led away in orange jumpsuits, looking nothing like the prosperous predators who'd sat in that cafe bragging about their system. They looked small, defeated, and suddenly very aware that their victims had names, faces, and a father who wouldn't stop until justice was served. Outside the courthouse, reporters had gathered. The case had attracted media attention. Criminal mother-son team targets vulnerable women, made for compelling headlines. Morrison handled the press conference, but she asked me to stand beside her, to put a face on the families they'd destroyed. When a reporter asked how I'd managed to take them down, I kept my answer simple. I stated that I'd been underestimated my entire life, as an immigrant, as a working man, as someone without fancy education. I'd learned that being underestimated was sometimes the best advantage you could have. These criminals had assumed that an old man couldn't outsmart them. They'd forgotten that age means experience, and experience means knowing how to win wars of attrition. That night, I brought Beatrice and Alice back to my apartment. It was temporary. We'd have her place secured and cleaned within a few weeks, but for now, it was safe. I set up the spare bedroom with a crib Roberto had donated, hung some of Alice's toys around the room. Beatrice stood in the kitchen doorway watching me work, tears streaming down her face. She tried to thank me, but I stopped her. I told her that fathers protect their children. That's not something you get thanked for. That's just what you do. Alice took her first unsteady steps in my living room that night, wobbling between the couch and the coffee table while we both watched with held breath. When she made it across and grabbed my leg for support, looking up with that gap-toothed baby smile, I understood something fundamental. Enrique and Marcia had thought they were destroying a family. What they'd actually done was show me what family really meant, not blood, not obligation, but the choice to stand up when someone you love is being crushed by people who mistake kindness for weakness. The sentencing happened on a Tuesday morning in October, 4 months after that Friday afternoon when their world collapsed. The courtroom was packed. Victims, their families, reporters, and people who'd simply followed the case because it represented something larger than one family's suffering. Morrison had built an overwhelming case. The final count was 13 victims over 16 years, totaling over $2 million in stolen assets. Enrique received 18 years. Marcia got 15. Ricardo's cooperation earned him 6 years, which still seemed like justice given his role in selling Beatrice's car and helping facilitate the frauds. When the judge read the sentences, I watched for their reactions. Enrique looked stunned, like a man who'd always believed his charm would save him finally realizing it wouldn't. Marcia sat rigid, her expensive jewelry confiscated, her real estate empire seized, her face a mask that couldn't quite hide her disbelief. The judge's final words stayed with me. She stated that the court saw these crimes not as isolated incidents of greed, but as systematic exploitation of trust during moments of vulnerability. She noted that the defendants had shown no remorse, only outrage at being caught. She expressed hope that the sentences would send a message that society wouldn't tolerate predators who dressed up cruelty in the language of family. Outside the courthouse, several of the other victims approached me. Sophia, the woman who'd lost her bakery 10 years ago, hugged me and whispered a thank you. Anna, who'd been struggling in Virginia, told me she was using her recovered assets to start a nonprofit helping women escape financial abuse. Eduardo, Marcia's son, who'd testified against her, shook my hand and apologized for his family's sins, even though none of this was his fault. But the sweetest moment came when Beatrice, holding Alice on her hip, walked up to Morrison and asked if there was anything she could do to help other victims. Morrison smiled and mentioned that the district attorney's office was always looking for people with lived experience to help train social workers and prosecutors on recognizing elder and financial abuse patterns. My daughter, who'd spent weeks sleeping in subway stations, was already thinking about how to help others. That's when I knew she'd be okay. The civil lawsuits were settled relatively quickly. Beatrice recovered her $60,000 plus interest, almost $75,000 after penalties. The apartment was returned with all equity restored. Her credit was repaired. The damage to her design career was harder to fix, but she found a firm in Brooklyn willing to give her a fresh start, one that offered child care benefits so she could bring Alice to work. I helped her set up the apartment again. We painted the nursery together, soft yellows and greens, colors that felt like hope. We bought new furniture to replace everything Enrique had sold. On the day she moved back in, Roberto and Maria brought a meal, and we ate together on the floor because the dining table hadn't been delivered yet. Alice crawled around exploring every corner, delighted by the space. As for my own life, I made some changes. I sold my apartment in Astoria and bought a smaller place 3 blocks from Beatrice's building, close enough to help with Alice, far enough to give them space. I used some of the proceeds to fund a scholarship at Beatrice's old design school for women returning to education after life disruptions. I also started volunteering at the Queen's Legal Aid Society, helping elderly clients navigate financial fraud cases. Turns out, 40 years managing logistics had given me skills in recognizing suspicious patterns in documents. I've helped 5 families so far avoid scenarios similar to what Beatrice endured. The money I'd almost lost to Enrique and Marcia? I set up a college fund for Alice, properly structured by lawyers who weren't criminals. She'll have options when she's older, choices that come from security, not desperation. I've also reconnected with old friends from the trucking days, men I'd lost touch with after my wife died. We meet for coffee on Saturday mornings, tell old stories, remind each other that age isn't decline, it's accumulation of experience, wisdom, and the knowledge that some battles are worth fighting no matter how tired you are. Beatrice is thriving now. Her design firm is sending her to a conference in Miami next month. Alice is 16 months old, walking, babbling in what might become actual words soon. She calls me something that sounds like Pop-Pop when I pick her up from daycare. I drove past that intersection near the Queensboro Bridge last week, the place where I'd seen my daughter begging. The traffic was just as bad, the heat just as oppressive. But now when I look at that spot, I don't see tragedy. I see the moment when I decided that being old didn't mean being helpless, that experience counts for something, that a father's love is stronger than a criminal's greed. People sometimes ask me if I'm angry about what Enrique and Marcia did, if I carry hatred for them. The honest answer is no. Anger is exhausting, and I've learned to conserve my energy for things that matter. They're in prison facing their own choices. I'm here watching my granddaughter learn to speak, helping my daughter rebuild her life, spending Saturday mornings with friends who've known me for 40 years. I think about my own father sometimes, about the lessons he tried to teach me when I was too young to understand. He'd say that a man's worth isn't measured by how much he accumulates, but by what he's willing to lose to protect what matters. He'd say that being underestimated is a gift if you're smart enough to use it. I'd tell him now that I finally learned those lessons. It just took 68 years and a Tuesday afternoon in July traffic to understand. There's something profoundly satisfying about watching your family heal. Beatrice laughs again, real laughter, not the brittle kind she forced during those dark months. Alice has no memory of sleeping in subway stations. Her childhood will be different, safer, built on foundations that can't be stolen. As for me, I've made peace with the fact that I won't live forever. But I've also realized that the time I have left is mine to spend on things that matter, my daughter's success, my granddaughter's joy, helping others avoid the traps that nearly destroyed us. Sometimes at night, sitting on my balcony overlooking Queens, I'll sip coffee and think about all the versions of myself I've been. The young man who came here with nothing. The businessman who built something from that nothing. The husband who lost his wife too soon. The father who failed to protect his daughter from a predator disguised as love. The grandfather who found his daughter begging on the street and decided that injustice wouldn't stand. All those versions taught me something crucial. The system isn't perfect. Bad people sometimes win in the short term. But if you're patient, methodical, and refuse to accept defeat, you can tip the scales back toward justice. I tell you all this from my apartment in Queens, where I can see the lights of Manhattan across the river, where the sounds of the city remind me that life keeps moving forward. I tell you this as a man who's 68 years old, who's buried a wife and built a business and survived every curveball life threw at him. And I tell you this as a grandfather who refused to let his family be destroyed by people who thought an old man couldn't fight back. Where are you watching this from? Have you ever had to stand up against people who underestimated you? I'd love to hear your story in the comments. And if this resonated with you, consider subscribing. I've got more stories to tell about what it really means to protect the people you love, no matter what it costs. Because at the end of the day, that's what family actually is. Not blood, not obligation. But the choice to stand up and fight when someone you love needs you most. And trust me, I'm not done standing up yet.